and he believes that he has done a great job. And Houghton, you are actually doing an assessment on this end, and I do hope that this time around you can actually finish your thoughts.
Let's keep going. Maybe the candidates will rock up as a result. So I think the first point, he talked a lot about religious leaders having been an important part of the second liberation struggle, the first liberation struggle, and so on. He talked a bit about Bishop Okulu and Muge and others. I think there are a number, and they're not just Christian. I mean, I think we have to think about Sheikh Balala. We have to think about the Chief Justice Emeritus, Willie Mutunga, a Muslim. We have to think about younger generation of people who are very grounded in their faith but come to give leadership. So I think that was interesting for me. The second point that I wanted to raise was the question that was raised about mental health, because I think I heard something interesting there that I think all the candidates could address themselves to. The first one is this. We know from the stats that something like 300 people are diagnosed with depression every day in Kenya. And we are the fifth or sixth highest number of people who have mental health issues. Now, we've seen a new mental health bill come to pass. It was enacted just recently. This is the Senator Kasanga bill. We've also seen a lot of investment in mental health institutions, and I think now you can use your NHIF card for mental health treatment. But the question we have not discussed yet is the issue of disabilities, other disabilities. So, for example, people with disabilities, I'm told, are something like about 8% of the voter base in this country. So that's a population of about 1.7 million people. I've not heard a strong argument for what candidates would do with regards to the issue of people with disabilities. What we've seen is really a gerrymandering or a fixing of the nominations that should be going to people with disabilities. And did we not see something like 79 party lists rejected just recently because people were using spaces for minorities and exclude marginalized communities for others? And I think we need to see more focus on all of the disabilities in the electoral race in the last few weeks of the elections.
Thank you. And Professor Witi, Houghton talks about this contrast that Waihiga Maure was trying to draw between himself and the other three gentlemen who are running for president in the country. And he basically says that he is the real deal because all these other guys have been there, done that, and there's a sense in which every one of them, according to him at least, can be associated with the problems that we have. Do you think that that was a convincing case that he was making, and did he succeed at it?
I think he made a good point, which Irungu already referred to, and I characterize it as a pastoral approach, that he is a good shepherd. And that is deeply inherent in his faith tradition. And you could see in his presentation, he talked a lot about corruption, the debt, the cost of living, integrity, values. So he was spot on the real issues that we should actually focus on. What begs in my mind is whether the voters out there are listening to the contrast that he's trying to draw. Because I think he speaks from the heart. And I think the question that he was asked about his public service record was a really awkward question. Because again, the question is, is public service just working in government? Or is public service basically serving this country in all other places like private sector, private endeavors, like being a businessman or something like that? But he draws a very sharp contrast. Now, the question he asks, which is pertinent, is all the other gentlemen coming to this stage have a public service record working in government, from Wajakoya to Raila Odinga to William Ruto. I think the challenge that he's putting before them is, why are we here? Right. What difference are you going to make? You've been you've participated in government that has basically brought us to this mess. The debt crisis, runaway corruption, a country that is devoid of integrity and a sense of values. I think he raises the right questions. And today we might actually say that he's not actually the fifth, he's the real deal.
Dennis.
I think, actually, to add on to what he's saying, my sense is sincere. He came across very sincere. His manifesto, of course, talks about restitution, and he talked a lot about that. My overall sense, it's a bit like the Constitution. It's ahead of its time. He's ahead of his time. If you see what I mean? He talks about things that
I'm
our
curious
politics
about that.
is not...
What do you mean he's ahead of time? Where is he and where are we?
The things he stands for are ahead of where we are. Let me put it that way. The values that Alex was referring to, that Irungu was referring to, it's not where we are.
But I mean, that is interesting because I've heard people say that what we've had in this country is national decline, that we have this regression that has happened in this country, that if you talk to anybody, whether it is about public transport, whether it is health systems and all that, there are people who actually said things used to be better. So I'm wondering whether we have regressed, as people say, or we are yet to get to that place where he is, because I find that a very interesting.
My sense is, okay, before the others, I think my sense is we have allowed standards to drop. Yeah. We have accepted falling standards. And he's basically saying this is the standard we should be at.
Wow. Sheila.
I like that this, do I call it an interview or a debate by himself?
Yeah.
That it started on the topic around values, ethics, morals. Because that's
music to our ears.
Oh, music to my ears. Yes, because it's something that we have really talked about for some time since we passed the Constitution. You know, what are the ethical and moral standards that need to be applied for those who are serving in public office? And because when you look at the picture now, when you look at the ballot papers right now, a lot of those names are people who are not fit to hold office because they've been accused of one offense or another.
That's an interesting distinction because you're talking about a different standard. Right now, in this country, the standard that we know, which we apply all the time and every politician in town knows about it, innocent until proven guilty, and now they added something until you have exhausted all your appeal mechanisms. So what you are talking about is a different standard, and that is an interesting one.
Yeah, we have applied a criminal standard to Chapter 6, which requires a moral and ethical standard if we're going to actually live and breathe life.
But how do we get there? If the Constitution is not going to give it to us, if legislation is not going to give it to us, how do we get?
The Constitution has already given it to us. The Constitution, and that's a supreme.
But on paper, but we don't live it. That's what I am saying. How do we get to a point where we actually live Chapter 6?
I think, well, for now, in the next 2 weeks, because this is what we are looking forward to, August 9th, is about Kenyans applying those standards as they make decisions on the ballot. And as Maure spoke, that is what struck my mind, because we need people who are bringing respect and honor to public office. When you get into public office, it is not your personal property. It is public service is bequeathed to you by citizens, and it therefore requires that you take care of it, you nurture it in a certain way. But we have seen people, individuals who have abused it, and are coming back to us. You have come, it's like you've given someone your car, they've gone, had accidents, banged it, dented, and then they bring it back to you and tell you, you gave me your Mercedes Benz, now I want your, what's a
house. You take the house.
No. Now I want your 100 billion shilling house, and yet I gave you something of smaller value and you dented it. So that's exactly what these people are doing. They're coming back to us, having tarnished those public offices and asking for even more. And as I listen,
in the Bible, there's something about being faithful in small things, then you can be entrusted.
Exactly, but that's not what's happening in this country. and for me, if we want to build this country on a strong foundation, not on sand, but on rocks, that is what we need to do. And then we can then be able to relieve all these plans that they have. If it's about gender representation, it's about the economy, it's about food security. That can't happen without talking about values, integrity, morals, and so on. But let me just talk about some of his comments that he made on issues around corruption, because he kept on coming back to it, the cost of corruption, and so on. I saw him talk about a lot of figures. I would have wanted to hear more about the qualitative cost of corruption. But then the other one is, I would have wanted him to just address some of the issues that he has raised and has proposed in his manifesto. For instance, and here he talked about strengthening institutions, particularly, governance institutions. In his manifesto, he talks about, for instance, strengthening the Asset Recovery Agency, because his manifesto is founded a lot on, returning stolen assets and he's talked about it. But then he talks about putting the Asset Recovery Agency under the presidency. And for me, I have questions around that.
That's
I would have wanted him to speak a little bit about that, because for me, that's not strengthening institutions. We've seen what has happened when the presidency has gotten involved in governance, certain governance processes.
How do you square that with this idea that you need something to be led, that you need leadership that is provided at the very top to get certain things to move? Maybe it's coming from that, because from around this table I can hear comments everywhere about the place of strong leadership, value-based leadership that is going to drive this anti-corruption war.
Yeah, but that's why we have independent institutions. And the reason why we have independent institutions is so that they're able to run without political or executive influence or manipulation, because we've seen that happen. And that is why, for instance, we will fault some of them for not performing to what is expected, because there's been a bit of interference, even in terms of how some of those individuals are selected and appointed. But here we actually need to let these institutions work independently, ensure that their leadership is competent. And how you ensure that is by ensuring that you're not meddling, because right now we have what we call political appointees in some of these institutions. And that's why I got worried when I hear that he wants to put some institutions under the presidency so that he can be able to drive the fight against corruption. I think the fight against corruption is best done under independent institutions. We have the Constitution, the legislative and policy frameworks that guide how they should work, and we should let that be.
And I'll revisit that, but I would like to hear what Wanjiru would say about David Wahiga Maure's 90 minutes out there.
Well, I think there's a role for the smaller parties, the fringe parties, and this is something we discussed.
Well, they don't like being called that, but I give it to you.
Right. I'm not sure what the politically correct term is.
I'm sure Jakoya wouldn't want to hear. Professor Jakoya is very...
Yeah. And part of their role is agenda setting, and it's to highlight and bring out with a lot of emphasis important issues that the larger parties have ignored. And I think in the case of Agano, they're looking at, it's an anti-corruption, governance, good leadership agenda. And I think this is the key, this is the main thing that's bedeviling Kenyans. Because we've got good plans. We've got countries that come and borrow our plans, go and implement them a lot more successfully. We've got good policy documents that don't get implemented. We've got very smart leaders. We've got a good constitution. So what's missing is the good governance, is in the leadership, integrity, accountability agenda. And I think as a Gano party, that is a very big contribution to the debate. Is it enough to, kind of push up the numbers and get a wide kind of appeal? It might not be, but if you look at what's happening, first of all, right now we are working under two coalition parties. So there's a role for parties that are issue-based. And as long as we are doing coalition building, as long as the party then is also serious in terms of not just showing up around elections, but staying in between, there is a role for parties that are issues-led. And this, I think, is the central party, central issue bedeviling us.
It's interesting that you're saying this is the central issue, and it is being championed perhaps more than anyone else by a party that you call fringe, because it is a small party. It's not as big as the behemoths that the coalitions are. Isn't that an interesting paradox in a country that the things that we say are important here don't seem to be pushing the electorate in any one direction? As a matter of fact, there is no evidence as we speak now that corruption, for example, would make people not vote for someone.
Yeah, it is a paradox, but maybe we can look at the example of like the Green movement, where you've had smaller parties, where you've had what was maybe a bit of a fringe issue, but a very important issue, now come to the center stage. So I really agree with what David is saying. Actually, I agree with all the panelists that it's very important to keep it on the agenda. It's an agenda we've been talking about and is kind of getting overtaken by the economic agenda. So it's important to Agano reminds us that economy is important, but you need to have the foundation. And possibly it's an issue whose time is not on the table, But until it is, we are going to remain in this kind of stop-start situation as a country where we don't quite achieve the economic potential that we can.
Dennis, you have done a lot of work in this economy governance space, whether it is Vision 2030, whether it is just sort of analyzing Big Four and all of these things. And there's a question that's troubling me here about the nexus between corruption and the economy, because it almost seems to some people that it is either or. And yet, what I'm hearing around this table is that they are inextricably intertwined, that you actually don't talk about the economy in any exhaustive way if you do not talk about the impact corruption is having in terms of impeding economic development.
Sure. You can't talk about the economy without talking about corruption. I think the arguments that are being made now, from what I'm seeing from the other parties, is that corruption does not have such an effect as it should. I think that's the wrong argument. I think this guy's argument is good because it goes back to basics. For me, corruption is the opposite of policy, if you see what I mean. So that every corrupt act is the negation of a policy act. Yeah? So if you're not doing the policy, which is the good thing, corruption is the bad thing. So you can't fix, and that's how you fix the economy. You fix the economy through policy. So for me, these things are completely related. They are related. I think the only point I'll make is, I don't know where his numbers are coming from. The 12 trillion, 15 trillion, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, even Houghton wanted to fact check him, but let's hear.
He makes a good point. A lot of these manifestos that are being thrown at us are all visionary. But there's no one telling us about legacy. And by talking about these things of 12 trillion or 1 trillion or whatever outside, he's telling us fix the legacy thing.
But that's one number I want to hear from you. We've been told every day that because the president said there is some 2 billion that is lost every day. I don't know whether you share the view that that is possible, whether that is... Because I've heard certain parties, and he also referred to him quite a bit, to that question of 2 billion quite a bit, and it's almost as if all these parties are beginning to even make policy proposals with that as a key assumption.
I think that's exaggerated. I think 2 billion is probably the total of misaccounted and unaccounted for money. I don't think it's all theft. I don't think so.
Okay.
I think 700 billion is high. 700 billion, a third of the budget.
2 billion a day. 2 billion a day is how much annually? That's
it's 700 billion. That's a third of the budget.
Right. Yes, but in terms of the minister,
but didn't the Auditor
Minister
General
of
talk about a third of the budget
the
not being
Minister of
accounted?
Finance has said that we lose in terms of tax expenditures, taxes, revenue unaccounted, between 600 billion to 700 billion a year.
It's now 300.
Pardon?
It's now 300.
Well, this was in 20. It was in 2020.
You have recklessly mishandled, or does it mean that somebody has stolen it? I think
The president said stolen. The Auditor General, Edward Oko at the time, actually said a third of the entire budget is unaccounted.
Unaccounted.
Yeah, unaccounted for, which does not mean stolen. You get?
I mean, I know this for a fact. Sometimes I lose some notes.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I've stolen them, right? But Joe, can I come back to just? I want to make 2 quick points, right? One is this one, right?
Yeah.
It's not a paradox, right? This point about corruption is the single most important issue in this country, but yet we are not voting for candidates who are fighting corruption or are saying this is the key area of their focus.
Refusing to vote for people because they appear corrupt.
Exactly. My son had a very interesting point. He said, listen, the problems are only big because we're not big enough to deal with the problems. It is the lack of capacity and agency within this country to deal with issues of corruption that is the issue that we have to address while we think about what is actually happening with the money. And this 2 billion conversation is one of them. The second point is this one. There is only 2 differences between a leader and a criminal, right? If we can just simplify this conversation. The first one is a leader has a conscience, right? Put in the face of temptation, they will not steal, right? They have a conscience. It is internal. If they don't have a conscience, then they have a fear of consequences. If you have a country in which there is people in positions of power who have no conscience and no fear of consequences, then you just have a chaotic country. And that's the point, I think, simplified.
But how do we get there?
You have to make corruption completely punitive. We have to criminalize it. We have to make sure that people are locked away. And secondly, that they're not put in positions. I mean, with a light touch with, the Agano leader, I do hope that if Maure is not the 5th president, that he uses his connections to get in touch with St. Peter, so that at the heaven's gates, at the pearly gates, there will be a metal detector, there will be lifestyle audit documents, and there will be warrants of arrest for those people who have disgraced their office on this kingdom. I think that's just another opportunity for Maure.
You see why I was raising this thing. Look, you were talking about corruption, making it difficult, making it costly and punitive and all of these things. But we saw, like, I think it's Sheila who mentioned someone, the former MP for Sirisia. He was jailed. Now the case is going through some process and whatever, but the guy is on the ballot, and who knows, he might get elected. So how do we get to that point where people actually have it in themselves that if you stink of corruption, look like corruption, walk like it, I won't touch you until you sort out your issues?
I mean,
how does it become
question for me is
an electoral issue?
Transparency International have been doing, really, which is that the ethics, the Electoral Commission should not have allowed them to come before us.
Yeah. Because that
is my simple
because
response.
When they go to the people, I mean, we've heard in this country somebody says, "Come on, Nimwizi wetu." Yes, it's a thief maybe, but our thief. Just leave him or her alone.
Yeah, because Joe, as they're going back to the people, they're also going back with proceeds of crime and corruption. And that's how people are getting convinced and mobilized, to vote for this. And that's happening a lot, even in this election season. There's been a lot of exchange of money at the ground. You attend a rally, you're paid to disrupt someone's rally, you're paid to intimidate others. There's been a lot of cases of voter bribery. Where is this money coming from? Those are proceeds of corruption. And that's how these people continue to get a lifeline, because they continue to convince Kenyans with money that is stolen. But what we need to do, in addition, and I agree with Irungu, in terms of ensuring that we kill impunity, the only way is by punishment. Yeah. But one of the other ways, other than using the law and enforcement and so on, there's a question we're not really looking at, is the whole question around culture change. Whatever we see, how Kenyans react, when you're given an option between heaven and hell, heaven being the good guys, hell being, people who have been tainted, we go for the people who are tainted, meaning that you'd rather go to hell. That's how I say it. That means that we need to see some kind of
all right,
change.
Sheila, I have to stop you. This time it is Sheila. Yes. So there you have it. You the presidential candidate and Deputy President William Ruto arriving there. And Rashid Abdallah is on standby. Rashid, kazi kwako.
Bila shaka Joe Ageo, ni kwamba ule muda ambao tulikuwa tunausubiri wa wale waniaji urais umefika kwa hivi sasa. Akiwa wa kwanza kufika ni mwaniaji urais kwa tiketi ya UDA chini ya mwamvuli wa Kenya Kwanza, ambaye si mwingine bali naibu rais William Samoei Ruto, ukipenda daktari, ambaye amefika katika muda huu angalau kuja kuzungumza na wananchi ili aweze kuweka ajenda zake paruanja, manifesto zake zieleweke katika mjadala katika siku hii ya leo. Kwa hiyo kwa hivi sasa tutakuwa tunamsubiri. Kumbuka ni mjadala wa pili, wa kwanza umeweza kukamilika, ambapo David Waiga Maure ameweza kueleza ajenda zake baada ya Profesa George Wajakoya kufika na baadaye kughairi kutoshiriki mjadala kwa sababu ambazo ziko nje ya uwezo wetu. Katika awamu hii ya pili itakuwa nizamu ya naibu wa rais William Samoei Ruto akiingia katika mjadala na aliyekuwa waziri mkuu Raila Amolo Odinga. Lakini kwa hivi sasa Joe Ageo, ni fursa ya kipekee kuweza kuzungumza naye, maana kumbuka ameweza kuandamana na watu wawili muhimu sana katika chama cha UDA wakati ule kule Kasarani, wakileta ajenda ya kwamba kama wanaafiki William Samoei Ruto kuwa mgombeaji wa urais kwa tiketi ya UDA. Yupo mama mboga mmoja aliweza kutoa swali hilo na mtu mmoja wa bodaboda akaweza kuidhinisha na kukubaliana hilo. Hivyo basi watu wao wawili ndio wale ambao wameandamana nao katika siku leo, pamoja na mkewe na familia yake. Kwa hiyo utanipa nafasi kwa hivi sasa kwa dakika moja tuweze kuzungumza naibu wa rais ambaye amefika hapa. Shukrani sana naibu wa rais kuweza kufika katika siku hii ya leo. Hii ni siku ambayo ina umuhimu sana kwa kwako, manake umesitisha kampeni zako ukasema siku ya leo ni siku ya mjadala. Ina umuhimu gani kwako, kwa chama, kwa muungano na kwa taifa?
Leo ni siku ya muhimu kwa sababu tumekuja hapa tupate nafasi ya kuongea na Wakenya. Wakenya waweze kujua tarehe 9 mwezi wa 8 wataamka mapema, waende wapige kura na wajue ni kwa nini wanapiga kura, ni upande gani watapiga kura na ni kwa sababu gani. Na ndio leo ni siku ya muhimu kwa sababu tutapata nafasi na wenzangu kujieleza, kueleza manifesto yetu, kueleza misimamo yetu kuhusu mambo ya muhimu yanayowahusu Wakenya na taifa letu kwa ujumla. Tutazungumzia mambo ya uchumi hasa, tutazungumzia mambo ya vile tunaweza kuondoa njaa katika taifa letu la Kenya, vile tunaweza kupunguza gharama ya maisha, vile tutaweza kuzalisha nafasi za ajira za vijana wetu, vile tunaweza kuhakikisha kwamba wakulima wetu wanaweza kuendelea na majukumu yao, na mambo yale mengi muhimu ya matibabu, masomo ya watoto wetu, mambo ya afya. Haya ndio mambo ya muhimu, na naamini ya kwamba Wakenya wanangojea kujua ni yapi tulio nayo. Tumewazungumzia pale nyanjani, lakini leo tutapata nafasi mwafaka ya kueleza kinagaubaga yale mambo ambayo tumepanga kwa ajili ya uongozi wa taifa letu.
Labda pende kwa utofauti naibu wa rais ni kwamba umeandamana na naibu mgombea mwenza wa chama, lakini hapa kuna watu wawili ambao walikuwa muhimu katika ule mkutano wa wajumbe wa chama cha UDA. Huyu mama ambaye aliweza kuleta swali na yule mtu wa bodaboda aweza kuidhinisha. Mbona ukawapa kipaumbele katika siku ya leo ya mjadala?
Kwa sababu nimeambatana na wao tangu tuanze hii safari. Huyu mama nilimpata kule Kiambu wakati tulienda kule kwa Economic Forum, na niliona ni mama mwenye ako na maono. Alitoa mchango wake kama vile wamama wengi na Wakenya wengi wa tabaka mbalimbali. Karibu Wakenya 90,000 walihusika katika kutengeneza manifesto yetu ya Kenya Kwanza, na ni baadhi ya wananchi kama mama huyu na huyu mungwana ambaye pia ni mshirika wetu mkubwa katika chama cha UDA katika muungano wa Kenya Kwanza.
Pengine kwa kauli ambayo anaweza kuitumia kuweza kumalizia kwa yule hasla ambaye anatizama, anatarajia nini sasa hivi kutoka kwa kiongozi wake?
Anatarajia kujua ni vipi yeye ataweza kuweka chakula katika meza, ni vipi mtoto wake anaweza kupata ajira, ni vipi masomo yake ya watoto wake itashughulikiwa, ni vipi kilimo kitashughulikiwa na serikali inayokuja, na ni vipi anaweza kuhakikisha kwamba ako na matibabu, na ni mpango gani tulio nayo kumshughulikia ili aweze kupata matibabu bila matatizo. Naamini kwamba haya ni baadhi ya mambo Wakenya wanangojea.
Naam, kila laheri katika mjadala, kila laheri katika mjadala. Naam, naibu wa rais William Samoei Ruto, daktari, akisema kwamba katika siku ya leo ashazungumza mengi katika kampeni Joageo, lakini ana fursa ya kipekee kuweza kuyachanganua kwa utaratibu katika mjadala. Hivyo basi ameandamana na watu wawili ambao ni muhimu sana katika safari yake yeye kuchaguliwa na kupewa tiketi ya uwaniaji wa rais. Narudi kwako ili Wakenya wapate fursa baadaye ya kujua mengi na wachanganuzi matarajio yao na hoja ambazo ni muhimu kujadiliwa katika siku hii ya leo. Joageo.
Shukran. Rashid Abdallah there speaking to the Deputy President who is the UDA presidential candidate in the Kenya Kwanza coalition in this election that is now just 13 days away. Dr. Ruto there talking about what he believes is important for the country and sort of giving a glimpse of what he hopes to talk about during this. And interestingly, Professor Witi arriving with his entourage, which includes the two people we saw who endorsed him, Pauline Waithera and Kelvin Okoth, sort of trying to remind us of what he has been saying out there in campaigns.
Well, the DP is a master of optics, and I think this is just basically one of those instances where he uses to full effect essential imagery just to construct a narrative that endears him more to the ordinary Kenyans, because those two people are very unlikely participants at this level in this country. We don't see ordinary Kenyans flank presidential candidates. But I was just about to say one thing. The reason why ethics, integrity, and values are subordinate in our political discourse and in political organizing is because the basis for political mobilization is still ethnic. If you look at Raila Odinga, he gets onto this stage because he has a strong support of the Luo community. Look at William Ruto, who has built an interesting coalition between his Kalenjin community and the Kikuyus. Mwaura does not have that luxury. And therefore, when he rides on values, Kenyans are not paying attention, because what brings us to this stage to even then invite these conversations are not the important things. These things come afterwards. But ethnic political mobilization is a huge problem that we have to deal with.
But Ruto has been saying this many times, that this election is about the economy and all of these things. And some people say that the ethnic question is not as pronounced in this election as it has been previously. Do you agree?
It is still a very strong undertone. It is the bastion that you got to start with. And when you see even your colleagues in the media basically trying to figure out how the electoral process is going to go, you always start with what you call the quote-unquote strongholds. In that entourage of Raila Odinga is Kalonzo Musyoka, okay, bringing in the big Kamba vote. In that entourage is the governor of Kakamega, bringing in the Luhya vote. And so you see this ethnic bifurcation being a very critical point of mobilization. So issues that are substantive to the citizens of this country, such as unemployment. How come we don't see youth mobilizing around the unemployment question? That even Mwaura today was just deplorable in the way that he handled it. He had no great ideas. And even Deputy President William Ruto and even Raila Odinga, nobody has any clue about how to mobilize the economic resources of this country to then create the traction that leads to jobs. We still imagine that if you're going to give us handouts in terms of grants and loans, that every young people can start a business. They don't want a business. They want jobs like you and I. They want jobs like the one that Ruto is seeking, not the jobs like their MPs. This economy of bringing your own job is not working. It never builds economies.
And that's a good place, Wanjiru, to kind of segue into this next debate that we are going to have in about 20 minutes' time, where we actually have two campaigns, markedly different in the platforms on which they are running. Both of them saying that it is the economy is stupid, as one American president said, but approaching this economy from very different directions. I wonder what you have heard and what contrasts or similarities you see in the overall platforms of the two main formations that we are about to receive. Hopefully we get both of them.
Right. So from my point of view, I think in terms of economy, there's been, and the manifestos, there's a win for Kenyans because there's a recognition of the importance of economy. Both manifestos bring out, of course, the economic issue as the primary one. The language is different, the way they've structured their manifestos is different, but they prioritize agriculture, where a majority of Kenyans are employed. They then recognize that a majority of Kenyans are also in the informal sector. And with Azimio, they try and link agriculture to manufacturing, to the informal sector, trying to really take a holistic look at saying if that's where people are employed, that's where we need to put money, we then need to add value, we then need to do marketing and therefore create jobs. So there's a very intentional effort to go back to what the economy needs. On the UDA side, KK side, they've also done the same. They've also prioritized agriculture. They've also prioritized MSMEs, looking at the informal sector. They've linked that to manufacturing. They also prioritize ICT. So in terms of the priority sectors, you can say they have prioritized both of them and recognize, using different language, that trickle-down economics is not working, that you really need to engage the majority and be meaningful in that way. So one, in terms of the broad economic priorities, I think they're on the same page. A slight difference because Kenya Kwanza takes more of an enterprise, social enterprise approach, whereas the Azimio takes more of a social democratic development approach, more welfare approach. But in principle, they have a good sell. And as manifestos go, much as we have, we're very cynical about them, we must remember that Jubilee Manifesto was kind of a jumble of projects that they tried to implement and essentially broke the economy. So we must hold these, whichever side gets in, and even the side that's in the opposition to their promise. But the big difference for me is in terms of the values foundation. Azimio makes is very explicit actually in terms of democracy, social justice, citizen engagement, putting public participation, civic engagement, as part of as part of their approach. So you see their democratic human rights-based approach. They have a section on governance. Their proposals are not as replete, but they do touch on leadership and integrity, ethics, anti-corruption. They go the whole gambit. But when you look at Kenya Kwanza, it's missing in terms of the values foundation. And their approach to governance is to strengthen institutions, which is good in itself, but really that's a basic, public, one, it's based in the Constitution, strengthens those institutions because they're focusing a lot on the oversight institutions, giving them enough money, giving them independence. That's the constitutional position. But they do not touch leadership and integrity. So, and you understand why.
And I want us to discuss that emerging dichotomy, whether that's something that we can look forward to in the coming elections. But Dennis, I wonder what fundamental differences, briefly, do you see between the two platforms that have been presented to us by Azimio and Kenya Kwanza?
Do you want us to close the Maure debate? Because I think there's still some issues that we didn't cover.
Well, we could go that all night long, but we have only 20 minutes to the next debate. So in fact, it is less now.
To say something quickly?
Yeah, I wanted to say something very quickly. I think either...
Dennis, is that you donating your time to him?
I'm donating 1 minute to him.
1 minute to me. So
1 minute to him.
It's about Wajakoya and facts. He has a very, very strange relationship with facts. And I feel really uncomfortable trusting him at the helm of government. He does not understand. He calls us a wealthy nation. Our revenue yield in 2020-2021 was just 1.6 trillion. In 2021-2022, by June, July to June this year, we're at 2.03. Our budget estimates at 3 trillion. I don't understand where he gets this notion that we're a very wealthy nation. We're really struggling with a huge debt overhang. His proposals about agriculture are really fantastic in an imaginary way. He has got a very agrarian fixation with agriculture. He has no idea about how pastoralism works. His whole fixation about agriculture is throw fertilizer in the soil. So I think this very flippant relationship with facts really undermines the credibility of his candidacy, especially when you want to trust him at an executive level to actually run a state bureaucracy.
And probably that would have been great to ask him had he showed up or had he stayed back and you make a great point. But Dennis, you were talking about
Thanks, Dennis, for the
these two formations, and I don't know how many of your minutes are left. But
just in general terms, I think I get the sense Azimio comes across as more looking at the production side, whereas Kenya Kwanza is looking at the market side. They talk about value chains. I think they built their whole manifesto around value chains. Kenya Kwanza. There was a very good differentiation someone made about the two. Azimio is more towards welfare society, whereas KK is towards fair society. So there's a kind of fairness. For me, and then there's, I think Azimio's is very much, there's a social charter. There's a social charter, social contract. I think that's what Wanjiru was saying. KK is very much empowerment. So it's about empowering people. And of course, the detail is different. I think there's some innovative things. I think KK has gone much deeper into things of public finance, talking about securitizing pending bills, an infrastructure bank. You know, they've gone into much more detail on the public finance side, so they're a bit specific on that. But I take Wanjiru's point, by the way. I think there's an important point on the governance. They've instrumentalized it. So there's no underpinning philosophy.
Yeah.
It's about instruments. Governance is an instrument, right? There are no underpinning values. I think that's a very important point, especially since, in fact, I wanted to make this point. In the forward to the manifesto, the Deputy President says he wants to do three things. Defend the Constitution, institutionalize our politics, and create jobs. It would be very interesting to see what that means.
Okay, Sheila, you haven't said anything. I don't know
Yeah.
what you see in front of us if any of these two people were to get to power. What distinctions do you see, especially from where you sit?
Well, first, I just want to, if I reflect back on the Jubilee Manifesto and why there were some, can I call them, some promises were dead on arrival, was because they really didn't look at the legislative and policy institutional framework. What is the current framework? That's something that I feel a lot of them are not looking at even as they make certain promises, and that is where a lot of them will struggle. So all the promises, when you look at Kenya Kwanza, Azimio, Agano, some for Jacoya, I don't agree with many of them, but they're good. They're good. I mean, if they're good in an ideal world, but then the practicalities of what is the current framework, both institutional policy and legislative for a country that they're not looking at, particularly when I look at, can I go back to my pet topic on corruption?
Yes. Yeah.
And I, like, for instance, like the DP is talking about giving financial and operational independence to institutions like, those responsible for fighting corruption, the judiciary, and so on, which is good, and which, as we have said, has been a problem, that most of these don't have the resources and even the independence, the muscle to be able to operate. But then there are certain challenges that we've seen, and I've not heard them talk about how they will address some of these challenges to their institutional, functional, financial independence of these institutions. Yeah. But for me, primarily as well, I think that when it comes to the issues around corruption, I still feel like they've looked so much on the issues around enforcement, but we're not looking at prevention. And for as long as we're not looking at fighting corruption from a prevention lens, we'll always be fighting.
Okay.
Yeah, and chasing after the money. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how they will actually prevent. And one classic way of starting to prevent corruption is by ensuring that people who have been accused, there I go with my song, people who have been accused of corruption don't get anywhere near public office.
Okay, so Houghton, you have only 1 minute, within which you hope someone will arrive. But you have the last word on this one before we take the break to go to the
maybe allow me to keep speaking until somebody shows up, right?
You have exactly 1 minute.
Yeah, I think what folks have said is, I would agree with much of what everybody said. I think, 6 months ago there was no galvanizing idea in the political space. I think we now have some ideas that are fairly cogent, they're clear, they're inspirational, they're aspirational. Of course, we're waiting to see budgets and schedules and the first 100 days, first 180 days and so on. But I think the harder questions will be, for example, what do we do with the parastatals that continue to drain the coffers? What are we going to do with the fact that we have huge recurrent expenditure bills in terms of staffing? Okay. What are we going to do with this pension that Jubilee had, which was to create infrastructure everywhere?
And I think
so these are some of the challenges.
And we can only get some of those questions, hopefully, inside the hall, because we want to take that break right now. And when we come back in the next couple of minutes, we'll be inside the auditorium to hear what the candidate who's arrived has for us, hoping that the other one will arrive at some point. But here we are, taking that break for the second and final debate of the night.